Hello and welcome to part 2 of our River Stort journey. In our last video we looked at the first couple of locks on the river and the river's eventual corporation and why it was made navigable in the first place. In this video we're going to continue our journey from where we left off up the Stort towards Bishop Stortford and look at some of the people that lived and worked on the river through the years and a factory that produced World War II fuselages for bombers along the banks. If you didn't see our last video, we journeyed from the end of the Stort up to about halfway, looking at the history of the locks as we went. We'll also look at some of the surrounding history before we get to Bishop Stortford, where we find out we're 2 weeks early for a festival, which we'll go back for. So come with us as we journey up the Stort, see if I finish the George Jackson Butby can and enjoy the ride. Beth's heading to work for a few hours this morning. Hopefully I'll pick her up when she's on her way back. But while she's at work, I'm going to carry on painting my Butby can for a couple hours. Then just before Beth's due back, I'm going to get the engine started, cast off and get the lock done just before she heads back. I managed to get quite a lot of the green hills done on the Butby can. The way you do it is by mixing 2 shades of green together and blending them so that they end up being sort of like a gradient. Someone came past us in the night, so now all the locks are against us and we're going to have to work extra hard to get through. It's pretty handy there was a boat coming in the opposite direction, so I didn't have to do the lock all by myself. After pulling into the lock, I noticed behind me there was another boater that turned up. I feel pretty mean as I've got to close the gates on him because we don't fit in the locks together on the Stort as they're only 13.5 feet wide. He came up to help me do the lock anyway as I was on my own, so it was pretty handy. His name was Alan, so thank you Alan, wherever you are now.
I don't mean neatly, I mean I'm very happy.
Tiny bit.
Yeah. Again, that's not me being mad.
I'm going to carry on our journey towards Bishop Stortford until I find Beth. And as I start leaving the lock, I spot her in the distance. So I guess I'd better stop and let her on. Not far from the lock is this bridge where Latton Mill once would have stood. Not far from the river, in Harlow's Northern Industrial Estate, there is a random patch of green you wouldn't expect to find. In this industrial estate, hidden between the dump and the aggregate railway siding, you'll find the remains of a Roman temple. The temple was built in roughly 20 AD on top of an existing pagan temple site. It probably would have looked something like this. I popped into Harlow Museum to view the artefacts they found at the temple site. Coins, knives and stoneware. They've even had some info on how they discovered the site in the 50s and 70s. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to see today, as the stone from the temple was used to build the church, St Mary's of Latton, found close to the museum. Our next lock, Harlow Mill, is one of the deepest on the navigation, with an 8 foot 9 inches full. It was one of two of the originally brick-built locks on the Stort. Joseph Salmon, his wife and their dog Laddie lived in the lock house from 1911 until Joseph's death in 1924. You'll notice in this picture there's no gate beams behind Joseph, but you'll see a very large stick which I'm presuming is called a hitcher. I'm guessing the lock keepers would have used this hitcher to hook into the gates and pull them across to open them. In about the 60s or 70s, when the gates were replaced, they added the gate beams that you can see today. Next to the lock at Harlow was Harlow Mill. The mill was demolished in the first half of the 20th century after it burnt down. But ever since I've been on the River Stort, it's always been a beefeater pub, making it our second riverside pub on the river. We're nearly finished with this lock now, but before we leave, I just want to spare a thought for poor old Joseph, who was 60 when he started working as a lock keeper. Leaving Harlow, this is where the river gets more greener and starts getting very windy. This is where we need to make a turn, and another turn, and another turn, and another turn, and another turn, until we get to the lock. How do you feel you just ran over a duck?
Distraught.
So after all that turning and terrorising the local wildlife, we finally make it to the lock, Feakes Lock, which is just another turn round the corner. Coming into Feakes' Lock, you'll notice port and starboard circles painted on the lock gates. Richard told me that a British Waterways employee painted them many years ago, just because he had some spare time. When he was asked to paint the gates again several years later, he was told not to forget the traditional port and starboard circles on the gates. There's not a lot really going on with this lock because it's in the middle of nowhere, but we've had a few engine problems, so we're going to get down in the engine bay and try and figure out why we keep leaking diesel everywhere. But whilst we were doing that, this wire beam appeared around the corner. You alright? Sorry, we were in the engine bay.
Oh, right.
Didn't think anyone was coming, then I looked up and was like, ah shit. We're coming up to our next lock now, which is Sherring Mill Lock. I always thought it had something to do with sheep shearing, but I think I was completely wrong because I think there was a sawmill here and the shearing could have been something to do with that. There was quite a lot of gongoozlers on this lock as there was a CRT event. Beth isn't too fond of being watched when she does locks, so she put the gongoozlers to work. In this photo from 1957 you can see Walter Lawerence's joinery factory and the location of Sherring Mill. During the Second World War, Lawerence's joinery factory produced over 1,000 wooden fuselages for mosquito bombers. Here, the women are lacquering the interior of the fuselage. The fuselages from Lawerence's would have been transported to de Havilland's at Hatfield. De Havilland's produced 7,781 mosquito bombers in all. In this photo you can see Sherring Mill in 1914. The mill was demolished several years later. Opposite the mill was Sherring Mill Lock Cottage. The owners that rebuilt the cottage opted to have a plaque of the now Baron George Duckett over their front door. George Jackson became George Duckett Baron when his second wife's uncle Thomas Duckett passed away in 1797. George inherited the Harlow estate in Wiltshire and adopted the title and coat of arms in order to secure the inheritance. A year later, his wife Grace passed away, leaving George, now 73, able to pay the mortgages he took out against the river in full. On our journey back through Sawbridgeworth, we came across this caff called the Waterside Caff. It's a really small caff with some great portion sizes. It can be found in the old maltings at Sawbridgeworth. One of my friends is really upset I've not got him found mine. Just north of Sawbridgeworth, around this bend, is the lock. Sawbridgeworth Lock. On the west side of the lock is where Burton Mill used to be, which you can see in this photo from 1948. In this photo you can see a British Waterways boat and two fellow Malta and Clayton boats taking on a load here. Next to Burton Mill were these maltings, which the building still exists today, but the malting chimney has now gone. It was quite hard to get a drone shot of this because there were lots of trees in the way. The malting buildings today have been turned into flats. I wonder what RSN stands for. Navigation, yes! This is a photo from 1901 when the lock used to be turf-sided. The wooden beam across the top of the gate is probably to help stop the gates from leaking. Leaving the lock, we've got a sharp turn towards Keckseys. Coming up in the distance is another low railway bridge, Keckseys Railway Bridge, which used to be a narrow gauge railway bridge. My camera cut out as we approached, so you'll have to make do with my panicked filming from underneath. We've arrived at our next lock, Tednambury Lock in Hallingbury, called Tednambury after the mill that once stood here in 1066. Seeing as the lock was against us, I decided to get the drone in the air. I really wanted to show you the mill here as it's been a part of my boat life for many years. I've been asked not to film the mill by the owner, but I bumped into Mike from the IWA who had some VHS footage of the mill in the 70s which you might like to see.
Down a quiet country lane near Gaston Green in Hertfordshire is little Hallingbury Mill, nestling in the Stort Valley twixt Sawbridgeworth and Spellbroke. A mill has stood here for generations. This present one is only 100 years old, but alas, no longer used for grinding corn. The great wheel is motionless, the millstones are silent, but there is activity. Here on the millstream are the moorings of the Lee and Stort hire cruises, and midst the charm of our English countryside, June and John Wilkinson tend their craft, and other folks prepare for a pleasant summer's day on the river.
Back to us at the lock, we found some more gongoozlers to help us do the locks again, which was handy. We were supposed to meet up with my dad here to give me cider, but he wasn't in. We were also meant to meet up on the river, but he's had a moorhen nest in his cratch on his boat, and he can't move until the babies have left the nest. I managed to get some wildlife footage after all. Not far from Hallingbury is our next lock, Spellbroke. Although it seems quite far as we kept turning back on ourselves.
Crash. Don't.
The last lock keeper here was Charles Welsh, who won Best Kept Lock competition in 1960, an award he won several times as reported by his daughter Jenny. Charles left British Waterways in 1962 and the cottage was demolished several months later.
You don't want to place all of them?
Benjamin Salmon was the lock keeper here in 1901. He was brother to Joseph Salmon, who was the lock keeper at Harlow Mill. The next lock is Tywford Lock, which my family calls Big Fish Lock, as there was a boat here called Big Fish for many years. The name of the lock comes from the mill, which was recorded in the 1086 Domesday Book. The mill here converted grain, peas and beans into animal feed. The mill was in operation until 1940 when it was converted into flats. When the Lee Conservancy began proceedings to purchase the river in 1909, the owners of Tywford Mill were the most stubborn to reject the Conservatory's contract on maintaining the water levels in the river. Each mill, existing or demolished, had to agree that they would not alter the water level by a certain amount in their stretch of water. The owners of Twyford were also made to stop charging tolls to boaters using the lock. There's only one lock to date that I've had to pay a toll at, and that's Alfie's Lock on the River Lee. When I was a kid, the owner of the lock house used to help the boaters do the locks and would demand payment in bounty bars. When he was away, we used to post them through his letterbox. We're coming up to our last lock now, number 1 South Mill, and as you probably would have guessed by now, this lock was named after a mill at some point. But at some point it was also known as Sow Lock or Fawley Lock. And we finally had our first major crash. That's more blacking to replace. A little while ago we agreed to help my mum and dad come through this lock. And my dad was telling me the story of how he bought his first boat. He bought the boat as a shell about 100 metres away from the lock. He then had it taken on a low loader to the River Wey, which is the other side of London. It wasn't until a couple of years later that he found out that the River Stort exists. Can't get him off the internet now. This is my nan and granddad on Evelyn's Joy, probably taken in about 93, 94. We're coming into Bishop Stortford now. I can tell as we're approaching the odd-shaped bridge which goes across the river. Under the bridge is this great little Chinese restaurant in the mill. This area used to be full of maltings and mills throughout. Recently though, the area has been redeveloped into flats. Several years back, the same area used to have a large gas holder between the river and the station. I can imagine somewhere along the curvy bits is where the photo of the postcard was taken that I've painted on the George Buck can. We're coming up to more now at the ends of the navigation. George used to have a large house here called Wharf House. Now the area is converted into a car park called Jackson Square. In the old terminus stretch is now a Wetherspoons called the Port Jackson, named after Port Jackson in Australia, named after... you get the idea. The river's route was changed during the 17 and 1800s to feed two terminus wharfs. Beforehand, the river was used to create a moat for Waitmore Castle, once home to Lady Edith the Fair, who had the displeasure of identifying King Harold's body after the Battle of Hastings. Today, Jackson Square car park covers Terminus Wharf and George's house, which backed onto the High Street. We've moored up opposite to where Swan Yard would have been. Lots of barges would have been unloaded and loaded here with various cargoes. The festival consisted of around 10 boats in total, and apparently I missed the parade by a few minutes. Hogcrawl's Cut, where the festival is today, used to be a timber yard. The crane still exists today, although flats have taken the timber yard's place. Whilst walking along the festival, I found a familiar face moored where we were a few weeks ago. It's my dad on his boat, selling some bucket hats my mum has made.
Yes.
People were more interested in the animals they have on the boat though.
No, he's very good.
This boat called Tree Lease is an old Brummagem boat. Alan, the owner of the boat, who has been restoring the boat to its former self, is the creator of the Buckby cans that I've been painting. The Buckby can on his boat is the first Buckby can he ever made, painted by a K on P Green boat. Her info can be found in the description. I painted this Buckby can in memory of the man that became the pioneer that funded and owned this canal, and although I didn't finish it before we got to Bishop Stortford, I finished it a few weeks later and donated it to Harlow Museum. I've been on and off this river for 15 years now, and I've really gotten to know it really well. Whilst researching this river, I really got to know how this river came to be as it is today. It's a shame this river wasn't very successful, but I'm grateful that the Lee Conservancy took on and saved this river in its time of need. Otherwise, none of it would be here today. It would have been a road, a railway, housing or industrial space. None of the locks would exist, none of the lock cottages would still be here, the wildlife would be reduced to a puddle or a ditch at the side of the road. None of the boats would be here, none of the walkers walking their dogs or hiking, and I'd certainly miss the river if it wasn't around anymore. I really hope CRT, the current guardians of the river, can maintain it for as long as possible. Hopefully this little video series will interest you in finding your nearest river or canal and finding out about its history. Finding out who lived there, what they did for work and how they did it, etc. There's a vast network of canals out there waiting to be rediscovered, as they were once the life veins of this country's industrial revolution. We're going to end this video plundering this pub for alcohol, as we're pirates after all. This is the first 2 videos we've ever filmed and edited together, and if you like them then please give us a like and subscribe to let us know how much you enjoyed them.